Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Can you hear me on that side?
Yes.
You can? No? Oh, well, I'll put on my special voice just for you. Is that okay? Please, can you hear me on that side? Okay, my name is Atu Kwesi, and I'm the director of the Center for Diaspora and Transnational Studies, under the auspices of which this magnificent event is being held. I'm a professor of English. And I was charged with setting up this center, which we've enjoyed doing very much. But more important is the fact that working on this center in collaboration with others has completely changed my attitude to what I do in my own discipline of English literature, which is that now I'm very sensitive to mobility. So when I'm reading a text and I see the description of a person getting up from one side of the room to even cross to the other side, I become sensitive. Why are they moving from one side of the room to the other? What is the cause of their movement? What is the nature of their locomotion, for example? What are the means of the locomotion? Are they walking? If they are traveling, are they walking? Are they riding a horse? Are they on a train, and so on and so forth? So I've become sensitive to mobility, all its causes and the factors that enable it, and so on. So of course, the question of human trafficking, partly because I've worked collaboratively with my wonderful executive officer at the center, Antonella, who will be welcoming Corinne after me. And she has educated me a lot about the nature of the traffic in humans. There's so many facts and figures that I'm sure Corinne Dettmeijer will share with you. But one of the things that I have transferred from my study of diaspora and transnationalism and my understanding of human trafficking back into the area of literature is how much of human mobility historically and representationally has been involuntary. I mean, we assume that you take Air Canada, you come to Toronto, and then you have a good time. There's a huge volume of the transfer of the global population stock that is actually involuntary. And the human trafficking, some like to call it the face of modern slavery. There are other ways of typifying it. The point I want to make is that the Center for Diaspora and Transnational Studies has been a place for the joining of intellectual wires, for the illumination of things that have been pressing in the history of mankind and that are actually more pressing now in the era of globalization. The Center for Diaspora and Transnational Studies is also a place that we like to call home, not as a place that we already know, but a place that we are all working toward. The diversity of background, diversity of races, and so on. And so I want to, I'm here to seize this opportunity to welcome you very warmly to the Big Tent conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Kwesi, for wonderful welcoming remarks. Before introducing our guest of honor and a guest lecturer, I'd like to talk take a few moments to talk about how the center relates to the study of human trafficking. So in September 2013, the center offered its first course on human trafficking, migration, and human rights, which was also the first of its kind at the time in Canada, considering that most of the migration and gender-related courses normally only tangentially cover the topic of human trafficking. Since then, we have been able to engage a number of students in the discourse on the topic and to inspire them to pursue the issue both academically, through as well, you all know, writing research paper, doing extensive research, analyzing the problem through an interdisciplinary lens, but also professionally by pursuing careers and internships, with a number of local anti-trafficking NGOs, as well as most recently with the US Consulate here in Toronto. So today is actually our last class of the DTS 405 course on human trafficking in contemporary slavery, and there's really no better way to end it but to have Ms. Corinne Dettmeijer-Vermeulen give the lecture. If I'm not mistaken, the Netherlands was the first country to appoint a national rapporteur on trafficking in human beings and sexual violence against children in year 2000, and Ms. Dettmeijer has been doing this role since 2006. The rapporteur is independent of the government, reports to the government, and has a statutory status. Ms. Dettmeijer, her main role is to report on the nature and extent of human trafficking and sexual violence against children in the Netherlands, and on the effects that the related government policies have. After completing her law degree at Leiden University, she started her career as a public prosecutor in Rotterdam. For many years, she has been a judge at the District Court of The Hague, and from 1995 until 2014, she served as vice president of the court. As a judge, she handled cases in juvenile, criminal, family, and migration law. She has been a member of several international professional bodies and advisory committees in the field of juvenile law. She's a member of the board of the Pro Juventute Foundation, the European Institute for Crime Prevention and Control, which is affiliated with the United Nations, and the high-level global task force to end sexual exploitation of children in travel and tourism. Last year, the Dutch magazine UofT elected Ms. Dettmeijer as one of the most powerful women in the Netherlands working on justice and public policy. It is our great honor to have you here at the University of Toronto and at the Center for Diaspora and Transnational Studies. And please, I'm asking everybody to help me welcome Ms. Dettmeijer, the Dutch National Rapporteur on Human Trafficking.
Thank you very much. I actually put this on. Now, can you hear me better now?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, we still have to get this to work. We've had some time doing this. Maybe it'll work now. And if not, I will give the presentation by heart.
Looks like it's good.
So we are prepared for everything. You can see here the whole of my presentation. And I will first tell you a little bit about myself, about the institute that I had, the way that the Netherlands interacts with the rapporteur. And then I will look at, well, basically three parts of the presentation. First, we will look at the nature and extent of human trafficking as we see it in the Netherlands, but also because you can never look at human trafficking just in one country. You always have to look broader than that, and I will put it in a broader scale. And then the second part will be the way we have dealt with human trafficking. Practically all the countries in the world, specifically those that have ratified the Palermo Protocol, are, you could say, based by the 3 Ps. And I will go into that later on. And I am now, after 15 years after the existence of the Palermo Protocol, looking more in the direction of a holistic approach. And what I mean by that, I will also tell you in the last part of my presentation. Oh, this is not what I'm going to do. We do this. Oh,
Yeah. That's not where we want to go.
no. Go back.
Go back to the start. And here we start.
And here we are. Thank you. What would I do without you? In 1997, there was the EU declaration that on human trafficking that every country should have an independent rapporteur. That did not really materialize. There is now a rapporteur in Sweden who works for the police. There's a rapporteur in Finland that is independent. There's a rapporteur in Belgium that's independent. We just heard this morning, Jamaica has appointed its first independent rapporteur. So if you look at the whole of the world, it is not really a common thing. But of course it was the Hague Declaration, so the Netherlands had to abide by that. And they appointed my predecessor in 2000. And that was the beginning, and it was still quite a small unit. We had just signed the Palermo Protocol, but it wasn't implemented yet. That took till 2005 before we did that. And many countries, it takes quite a long time before you can do that. And maybe everybody who wants to take notes, it's wonderful, but we will share this presentation with you with a link if you would like that. And then, well, that might be easier on you. Anyway, so in 2000, the first one was appointed. I started in 2006, and that was then still a part-time job. I have a long career as a judge, and I was still a judge for 2 or 3 days a week, and for the rest I was a rapporteur. But then in 2009, the mandate on child pornography was offered to me, and I didn't really know so much about it at that time, but it was obvious that the subject of child pornography was not really tackled sufficiently, and this was observed by both the police and ECPAT, the NGO to end sexual exploitation of children. And they both, well, advised the government to give me this mandate. In 2011, I issued my first report, and I said, child pornography is really only a part of sexual violence against children. And if you focus on only the cyber part of it, I mean, it's extremely important to look at it, but if you only look at that part, you're forgetting the whole realm that that sexual violence against children exists of. So I said to the government, I can either give back my mandate, because I'm not going to report on this again, or you can give me the whole mandate. That's when I started, I think, working a week and a half per week. So we can, but this is what makes it interesting for our office, I think, is that the two mandates are sometimes overlapping, and that having two sets of researchers on each subject, and well, having this interaction between them deepens the knowledge of both areas. And that's why I'm here now this week in Canada with Laura and Frank, who are from two different mandates and have learned this week more about each other's work, I think, than before. And in 2013, there was the law on the National Rapporteur. We really worked very hard on that. And this was maybe even more driven by the sexual violence against children part than the trafficking part, because we've had, like you have in many, well, I think in all countries, there are incidences, and sometimes bigger and sometimes smaller, of grave sexual violence against children. We see it in residential homes, we see it in the Catholic Church. Very recently in the Netherlands, there was an incident with Buddhist leaders. And every time something like that happened, a committee would be installed and try to find out how this was possible. And I said, we know that it is happening all the time, so why not have an institution, then my institution, that is a permanent factor and looks at how to prevent these kind of things from happening. Not saying that we can completely prevent it, of course, but I think that policy is better and more effective if it's not incident-driven, but research-driven. And that is one of the things that my bureau and we are all about. I already said this, the Palermo Protocol in 2000 is, of course, for the whole of the world, the most important incentive, has been the most important incentive to see trafficking for what it is, modern form of slavery. And there's, I think it's coming out shortly, the review, anti-trafficking review on the occasion of the 15th birthday, if you would call it that, of the Palermo Protocol, and my staff has also written an article on that. And I think that this is the fact that it's so widely ratified, and of course we also have the TIP report to see to it that many countries abide by this protocol has done a lot. And the Netherlands has taken the exact wording of the Palermo Protocol in its criminal code. We have the whole of our criminal code on this issue is a lot longer and also encompasses some older legislation, but the main body of the law is the Palermo Protocol, and Canada has done the same thing. So that binds us. I'm starting with the nature and the extent, and here too we see that we can learn from each other. Of course, if you look at this is a familiar image for everybody. This is also something that is worldwide, and of course, prostitution and human trafficking are in a way intertwined. I'm not saying one is the cause of the other, but there is a lot of, you cannot look at human trafficking and not see prostitution, or the other way around. So lots of countries have different ways of dealing with this, and I know that you are about to really change your prostitution policy. And maybe the reason for that, as we've talked with many people in the last week, is also the large part of domestic trafficking that occurs in Canada. The Netherlands too has quite a big portion of domestic sex trafficking, not as large as in Canada, but nevertheless really sizable. And of course, if this is what you see, and you see also that very often a more vulnerable part of your population it becomes a victim. That is important to see, to maybe change laws on this perspective. I know that the ideas on these are here kind of divided, and in the Netherlands we have another system, but we have changed our system 15 years ago. Maybe we'll change back one day. But I think that what's important for every country to see that prostitution is not human trafficking, and human trafficking is not prostitution, but they have this relation. And if you just forbid prostitution, doesn't mean that you end human trafficking. But you always have to keep in mind that when we're talking about human trafficking, you have to look for it. It's not a crime that comes to the police. It's a crime that you have to go out and get. So if you think your streets are clean, go look in the apartments, go look in the hotels, go look everywhere, because then that's where the trafficking for sexual purposes will take place. It's not, well, this is a very annoying tune, and you hear just slightly. are many of these short films, and what this really emphasizes is that how close to where normal everybody is, this can happen. And I think that that is important, that is what you see, that the public awareness, that is a very important point to work on, because the knowledge that this happens all over and maybe even in your street, well, then the problems come very close, and that maybe means that you can do something about it. Now here we see somebody cutting hemp. Contrary to what you may believe, this is not a legal thing to do in the Netherlands. So when people are trafficked or exploited in the hemp culture, that is a criminal offense. And we see this too. We see it with people from Central and Eastern Europe. But not so long ago, a few years ago, we heard from the UK that a lot of Vietnamese young children, 12, 13, were used in this sector because they had these small fingers and could do this very well. And I talked about that in the Netherlands, and I was told, we haven't seen that. No, it doesn't exist here. And then, of course, it does exist in the Netherlands, and one of these cases surfaced. And that's really with everything. One of the things that we've seen, that we've heard about from the US, and I'm sure you will have that here too, is the care for the elderly. With people getting older and older, well, there's a need for people to take care of them, and it's not any longer the daughter or the daughter-in-law who does all this. So sometimes these, people will be gotten from abroad, like you have the Philippine au pairs that have shown us also some kind of modern slavery and exploitation. We will, in the end, also have we will see that in the care for the elderly. And what I mean by that is, there's no place in the daily life that will not be affected in one way or the other by some sort of exploitation. The kidneys, the organs, we haven't seen that in the Netherlands yet, but we've done, the University of Rotterdam has done a study talking to medical people whose job it is to look after patients with need a new kidney. And half of them said that they have in their career seen one or two patients that have come with an organ from abroad. Well, of course, there's an enormous shortage of kidneys. And if you're on that list and you know you're going to die and you will never make it to the top of the list, well, maybe people will go somewhere else and either buy an organ, and if you buy it and you pay an enormous amount of money for it, I would still not really think it's the best way to do. But if you buy it and somebody gets rich, but not the person who donates the organ, then I think that's not a good development. And I think that governments should be much more adamant in getting people to sign up for organ donation, but also on awareness raising for doctors, and maybe doctors should organize between themselves sort of ethical discussion. What do we do here? Do we will we report it or not? Can we report it? What do we report? But it should be an issue that to talk about. Begging. The Oliver Twist story is really not so old. We see that quite a lot. there was a huge case of about 1,100 children from Romania, Roma children, who had been put out to beg and steal throughout Europe and, well, had to bring in an enormous amount of money. And that whole ring of traffickers was only revealed by the cooperation of with Europol and really international cooperation, because trafficking knows no borders. So even if you see this, keep in mind they had an influx of Albanian children who were forced to beg in Greece, and the Greek government said, please don't give them any money, because if you give them money, there will be more and more and more children, because it's lucrative. And so this campaign worked, and the giving of money, well, decreased substantially, and the problem also decreased. I'm sure they went elsewhere, so also in other countries you have to do the same thing. But this is, your first instinct is, specifically when they're small children, to give them something. Not a good idea. I don't know if you have that, but we have these vendors of a street newspaper, and that used to be for homeless people, and it was really a good way for them to get some money, have something to do. In the Netherlands, this has been completely overtaken by organizations from Central and Eastern Europe, and it is organized crime. So I don't buy this newspaper from the grocery store that I go to every day, and he's there every day, and we say, we greet each other. I don't give him anything, but they get dropped off by buses, and we know, I mean, we've also already had a conviction on one of these cases in the Netherlands. So it is everywhere, in every sector you can think of. And how big is it? We're going to hear something now too, right? Were the music or the sound a little higher, it would have been more impressive. Those figures are impressive. They're not really true, all of them. There are a lot of data or figures, certain numbers circulate on the amount of people who are trafficked. And if you really look into it, well, many of them are based on guesses. We are very good at the guesstimates, and we need to put more emphasis on improving the estimates that we do, because you can never really count it, but the estimates aren't good enough yet. But they are getting slightly better. But in reality, it is so many that maybe 10 million or 11 million, it's too much. If it's 30 million or 31 million, it's too many. So it's this is more to show how it is everywhere. And you must remember the Oscar that 12 Years a Slave was given for, and he repeated some of the numbers you've just seen in this short movie. We have a newspaper that checks facts, and when they check a fact, so they wanted to check this fact. What's the figure that he named on while receiving the Oscar. Was that figure correct? So they phoned my office and asked me, could I please comment on that? And then I said, it isn't really correct, but the fact that he said this at the Oscar nominations in this enormous audience, televised over the whole world, is much more important than the exact number in these circumstances. So I would say it's correct. That's right. If we look at the Dutch numbers, what you see here are the numbers of possible victims. Not victims where a conviction has already taken place. These are victims that are reported to our Center of Promentia. This is an NGO that registers these numbers for me, so I can come out with my report. And what you see here is that there are many Dutch. We see the big portion of Dutch victims, domestic trafficking, and then you see that even of those Dutch victims, 40% of them are underage, which is probably underreported because the age of the reporting is noted and not the age of when the trafficking started. And that is, I think, very important with the Palermo Protocol and the wording that it has taken in both our laws, is that the grooming part, the transporting, the harboring, all before the actual exploitation are already a full-fledged crime of human trafficking. For the rest, in the Netherlands, we see many victims from Central and Eastern Europe, and of course that is also because the borders are open and it is easy to get in the Netherlands. Oh, I should have done this before. Okay. So I'll do this now. The forms of trafficking. The blue is the sex trafficking. The red is the ones that haven't, it's the labor trafficking, and the black are those that haven't worked yet. And we also have a part that's not really known in what sector. Of course, the sex trafficking is the largest part. In many Western countries, we see that is the largest part. Worldwide, I think that the labor exploitation might even surpass the sex exploitation. And we also see that it is a lot of women. If we look at labor exploitation, it's not such a difference as it is in sex exploitation, but that women are victimized most is something that you can say. Now, if we look at the important dates in the last 15 years, we start with Italy, Palermo Protocol. We have the EU framework decision, which held about the same things as the Palermo Protocol. Then there's the Convention of Warsaw. Canada hasn't ratified the Convention of Warsaw. The difference between the Palermo Protocol and the Convention of Warsaw is that the Convention was the Council of Europe, emphasizes more on the rights of the victim. Palermo Protocol is very law enforcement driven, and of course it has some paragraphs on protection as well, but the Convention of the Council of Europe puts the victim at the center. And I think that Canada, even though you aren't party to that, is also influenced by what was convened there. And then with the European Court on Human Rights, and in 2010 they gave a very important decision. It was their second major decision on human trafficking, where they said that it's not just law enforcement that has a role to play in identifying a victim, it's practically all government officials. And that means from immigration services to housing agents to really everybody in the government has a role to play. And this too has influenced the Dutch way of dealing with trafficking substantially. And I think that it's a good development, because if you just leave the fight against human trafficking with the law enforcement, well, you miss out, because trafficking is it's something that undermines the whole society. We didn't want slavery anymore. We do not want modern slavery, so it's something that concerns all of us. When I was just a rapporteur and still working in the courtrooms, I was a juvenile judge. I had a court session with 4 cases of children who had to be placed in institutions. And the first one was a girl who was supposed to be a victim of domestic trafficking, a 16-year-old girl that wanted to go back to this, as we call him, lover boy. Terrible, please don't take over that word, but that's what we call it. This trafficker, and for her own safety, she had to be placed in a closed institution. And then the second case were 2 toddlers, but their parents were charged with trafficking in a Chinese massage parlor. And they were the owners of this massage parlor. And these small children had to be put in foster care because the parents were in prison. And then the third one, 4 cases. And then the third one was a boy about 16, and he didn't go to school, and his mother was at her wit's end. She didn't really know what to do to get him out of his bed in the morning or during the rest of the day and get him to do anything. And then at one point she said, you know what, he has this whole room full of knives and other similar equipment. So I said to him, why do you have that? I mean, what's the point? Why? And he said, well, my sister was a victim of a lover boy, and I had felt the need to protect my sister and my family. So here in an afternoon of 4 cases, 3 already had something to do with human trafficking. Of course, I was a rapporteur by then, so I combined these things. But I think that if you open your ears and eyes to this, you will see more of it and identify more of it than you would ever think possible. There we go. This is like I said, the awareness, the 3 Ps that has been the basis of practically every nation's fight against trafficking. It is prevention, protection, prosecution, but we can also talk about punishment, partnership, public-private combinations. We can find a lot of other Ps. And one of the things, and we've done that over the past years, and the former UN Special Rapporteur on Human Trafficking added this with C's and R's, and it's really a really nice talk that she gave, but it's sort of structuring what we're doing. And if you see here, you see the at the right, you see the perpetrator, at the left you see the victim, and you see those lines going. Prevention, we are sort of trying to see them both perpetrator and victim. Protection, that's really the victim. Prosecution is really the perpetrator. So what do we look at? We look at prevention programs. A lot of the prevention programs are targeted, well, practically all of them, at the victims. You might become a victim, and not you might become a perpetrator, or maybe you see somebody who's a perpetrator. So it's very victim sensed. We did have a little picture here. We don't anymore. Okay, that's okay. Well, these I will sort of describe what you could have seen. It's later. Okay. Oh, I thought it was going to be here. Well, you'll see it later on. But I think I will tell it here, and because this is prevention is the hardest thing to do, primary prevention, and I really don't understand how we have not been able to decrease the number of domestic victims. Why not? I mean, they're in our schools. They should be susceptible to some way of preventative programs, and they're not. Why not? Because when they are wooed by some boy who later on wants to exploit them, you can tell them up front, you know, this boy doesn't really like you. You mean doesn't like me? I'm 14, and he's the first one that's really shown interest. The girl who's going to get trafficked, that's that stupid girl next door. Me, he really loves me. This is something, we will see those pictures later on. It is a very nice program. It's called Two Little Girls, and it's targeted at Central and Eastern Europe. And it's in Albanian, Macedonian, all languages from around there. It could be the same here or in the Netherlands, because it's a 13, 14-year-old girl that thinks that this boy is really into her. Perpetrators, like I said, not so much. And then we come to the facilitators. Now, I think that many organizations and even some governments can be facilitators without knowing it. So this is also target them to get some prevention on that part. And one of the other important things of the prevention programs, of course, is the training. A lot of training should be done to all government officials, because you have to recognize the signs of trafficking. I think about 2 years ago, there was a train coming from Belgium to the Netherlands, and there was a huge man with 2 or 3 young girls, and they had sort of bag with them with all sorts of lingerie, and I'm guessing they were not white cotton underpants. So this man in the train said, I don't really trust this. I mean, this huge man and these girls doesn't look right, doesn't give me a good feeling. So he called in to the railway police in Utrecht and said, they're on the train now, we are in this compartment, and they will come out at Utrecht. And they were apprehended there. Now this, I think, is a very good example of how training and awareness can, well, prevent trafficking from happening. Now, if we look at protection, that is mainly targeted at victims. Well, you might even say completely targeted at victims. We have shelters with just victims of trafficking in it, cattle shelters. I think they started in 2008, and I know that there's a debate here too, whether or not victims should be sheltered in domestic violence shelters or should be in specific shelters. I was very much in favor of at least trying to see how the pilot with categorical shelters would work on, for instance, the healing of the victims, but also the their ability and cooperation with law enforcement, because in the end we want to get the traffickers preferably behind bars. And we've noticed that this really has worked. It's good for victims, because if you're a victim, it doesn't necessarily mean that you are a really nice person, or accommodating, or thankful, or you don't have to be. I mean, it doesn't really work that way. And if you've been in prostitution and you come from Nigeria, for instance, like many of the victims that we've seen, and you are put into a shelter with Dutch victims of domestic violence, you don't necessarily fit in very easily. The social workers in that shelter aren't always so sensitized at what your specific needs are, and their cooperation with the police was practically non-existent. And this has really improved greatly in the Cairo shelters. So it's no longer a pilot, it's a fixed part. And the care organizations that there are getting better at working together. Sometimes NGOs, I'm not saying that they work against each other, but they're all trying to get to the same funding, and there might be a little competition, which is not always the best solution for the victims. So this working together is really an important part. In the Netherlands, we have a platform of NGOs to try and not steal each other's bread. No, I'm kidding. But and a lot of the NGOs in the Netherlands are also partly government funded, and that's maybe also a difference with Canada. And what should all this cooperation lead to? Well, we need much better diagnostic instruments. We need a lot of research done, and it's coming. It's so I mean, we're not there yet. We might never be there yet, but we are making good progress. And then at the prosecution part, we have certified investigators that we've had really a long time, even before I was there. And they have their meetings every 2 months from all the Netherlands, so they really share information and knowledge. So that, I think, is really very important. We've specialized public prosecutors. We have those since 2009. And one of the things that is, I think, an important part of this is that they are allowed by their bosses to go out and get those cases. So it's not just that when a case comes to the prosecution office that the specialized prosecutor will look at it. No, he can target specific sectors. Say there's a lot of rumor or anecdotal stories about a asparagus farm in Brabant. They can go out and see what's happening there. And then, and of this I'm really very proud, we have specialized judges. And coming from the judiciary myself, this was one of the first things that angered me, is when you have big investigation and victims are being treated and all this work ends in acquittal. Okay, that's possible. If there's no proof, then, I mean, perpetrators have their rights in the courtroom. What I saw was that judges sometimes acquitted defendants, not because there was not enough proof, but because they didn't know enough about the law. And of course, the law is one thing, but if you have a law based on all sorts of international instruments, you have to know a lot more about that. So I really think that specialized judges is very, very important. And not just specialized on the legal part, but also on the the non-legal part, how to deal with victims, how to understand that that the consistency of a victim story is, I mean, I know a judge wants consistency because that's the easiest. But if a victim tells the same story from the first moment to the last, you can be sure it's a lie, because it never happens that way. The victim needs time to get to all these parts in the head or the heart or wherever he or she has put all the trauma and all the awful things that have happened to him or her. So you need time for that, and you have to understand why consistency may not be the main thing to look at, or understand why consistency isn't there. Now, since 2 years, we are specializing judges, and we have many of them now, and we have seen that the conviction rate has increased from 59 in 2009 to 74 in 2030. This, I can tell you, was not an easy path. Judges are stubborn, I know, think they know best, I know. So it needs a lot of, evidence-based convincing to get them to see that this is what they need. But once they've passed that threshold, the professionalism of the average judge, I'm speaking for the Netherlands, but I think we have that worldwide, gets them to be really interested in this theme and really wanting to do it well. So this is what we have seen. Now, by the different, I mean, we've accomplished quite a lot in this way of dealing with it. Advantages were the awareness, the structure, the order, but they also lead to fragmentations. If you look at my older reports, there would be a section based on prosecution, a section on police, a section on care, and the NGOs would read the section on care, are we doing a good thing? The police would read the section on investigations. But what we need is integration between those fields. So now my reports read differently, and this is something I think that needs to be, well, you need to have come some way to see that this might be a better way of dealing, a more holistic approach. So we still have 3 Ps, but now they're all called prevention. And we can add another 2 or 3 Ps, and they will all called prevention, because that is really what the whole thing is about. And you will also see that the lines of victims and perpetrators, it's a straight line, and they're together. When we look at primary prevention, we should target at victims and perpetrators both. When we look at secondary prevention, same thing. Tertiary prevention, same thing. Because if you only deal with half of the problem, then you will in the end fall short. And the key elements to prevent are the vulnerabilities to address, to become a victim, or a perpetrator. We don't really know enough yet about that. And maybe if we know more, then we will improve the way we deal with this. We see that, this is one of the advantages of having 2 mandates. We see that a lot of victims of trafficking come from a background where there was sexual violence, sexual abuse. We see also that perpetrators, when we see that, this is also still a small study, so we need a lot more research, come from a background of domestic violence, sometimes of bullying. So look at both parts. One of my staff is now doing her PhD on perpetrators of domestic violence, and I'm really very curious as to what comes out of there. She tells me some parts of it now and then, but I'm not going to share it. Now here are the stories. This is the average girl, no matter where she lives. And this too is the average girl, no matter where she lives. So you don't need, there they're looking at rings. See, there they are. And there they go on a trip together. Flying. And this is the end. And this is really, you don't need any language. The animation is nice too if you look at that. But this is universal. And we as a universe, as a global society, have not yet come up with an answer to this. So I think we need to do that together. And if we look at the secondary prevention, we want to identify and stop an exploitative situation. Once a victim is a victim, we need the tools to end that situation. And those tools are, they're not one-dimensional tools. They are tools that you take sometimes from the housing department. There's one big case in the Netherlands that was identified because neighbors complained about the smell. And then the housing department went to this house, and there were, I think, about 30 or 40 people from Indonesia in an attic where they slept in too dirty circumstances to even imagine, and cooked shrimp crackers. Now this is a Dutch thing that we eat a lot. They're cheap, no wonder they're cheap if they are made like this. And you deep fry them. Now you can understand, in an attic with so many people, with this deep frying going on the whole day, that is, 40, 45 degrees Celsius, that's inhuman circumstances. So the housing department, they know the people, the law enforcement, they have this integrated approach of both the administrative and the law enforcement and the care to deal with this kind of thing. And in the end, you have also to share the success. This is one of the things that they learn from this. So that's why I'm telling this story. It's the housing department who saw this and said, this is exploitative, this is human trafficking, and that's the way we should deal with it. And like I said, local government is really, really very important with this. Now, I heard yesterday, it sort of surprised me, that if a federal law is passed through, a federal bill is passed through, for instance, the bill to prohibit prostitution, that in municipalities or provinces, you can still not abide by that law. To me, that was a new one. But what you need this federal law, but the implementation, even if you take on the law, is the local government. So if you as a country say, we ratify the Palermo Protocol, and then in the end, maybe in, The Hague is, or the city where the government resides, everybody agrees, but in the local government, the city council will say, well, we need new, a new halfway home, for instance, and that's much more important than to put money into the ending of, or the fight of human trafficking, then that's a local decision. I did a study on 4 municipalities in the Netherlands, and 2 of them passed my judgment. 2 of them didn't. And they didn't really like this, but I really looked at that very closely, whether or not they had an action plan, whether or not there was any awareness of human trafficking, and not just the sex trafficking, but for instance, if you in a smaller town says, we don't have a prostitution area here, so there's no sex trafficking here. They can still have a 14-year-old who grows up in their community, who is taken away from that community and put to work somewhere else. So there they have a role to play as far as prevention is concerned. That child now, after her trafficking ordeal, maybe wants to go home to her hometown. After 4 years in prostitution, she doesn't really want to live with her parents anymore. That's not really going to be easy. But she wants a house in the place where she comes from. There's a responsibility for that local government. And I've spoken to local governments who said, well, you know, agriculture has a hard time. It's an economic crisis, and we're not looking too closely at what's happening at that tomato nursery or whatever. And I said to them, you can't do that. As a government, you are, even a local government, you are, you're obliged to do something about that. And also look at what's happening, and maybe with foreigners, doesn't matter. Look at what's happening in and around your municipality. I live in The Hague, and I think The Hague, well, like most big cities, are kind of sensitized to this problem. I live in a street, I have a nice house, and opposite me there's also a nice house, and there was a hard work going on there. People from Croatia, I went to look there, I saw these signs, you know, they start at 7 in the morning, they work very hard, even worked on Saturday. So I thought, this is what I'm trying to tell people, to get sensitized to this kind of thing. So I went over and I talked to these men, and I could communicate with them, and they said, well, this is what we do. We work here 3 weeks, and then we go home for a week. And of course, it's possible. If they paid well, if it's, you know, their circumstances are okay, then it's just labor migration. But I called the police, and I talked to this woman. And I said, well, you know, opposite me, and I was explaining the situation. Oh, yes, ma'am. Well, they're just foreigners. I said, well, you know, oh, this is what foreigners do. And then I said, I'm the Dutch National Rapporteur on Human Trafficking. Didn't make any impression. But I did go on and find there was no trafficking there. But it's hard for everybody to be sensitized to this, but you still need to do it. But if we look at this one goal, we need cooperation between different instances, like I said, the housing, law enforcement, care. But also within law enforcement, there should also be an integrated cooperation. Sometimes you have one part of the police that deals with, well, maybe the prosecution is, I have a better example from the Netherlands. One part of the prosecution offices deals with drugs, and the other one with human trafficking. Now, you saw this hemp cutting in the beginning. I showed you this hemp cutting is an offense, criminal offense. So he was subpoenaed by the drug part of the prosecution office, and they didn't talk to the human trafficking part of the office. Now, there too is room for improvement. That has improved already in the Netherlands, and there have been some changes made there. But that is just as important as the cooperation between the different organizations. And one of the things that we've also seen is that the red one are the perpetrators and the blue ones are the victims. That the regions where they come from, victims and perpetrators, are usually from the same region. And this teaches us a lot about how to look for things. There are many Nigerian girls coming forward just to say they have been a victim of trafficking. We find no Nigerian perpetrators. Are we looking enough? Should we maybe look at Belgium where they do see them? Maybe there's a connection there. So these are all things that you have to take into account. So if we look at, oh, I forgot one thing. I'll go back, because this is really also a very important one, is the care of victims and the way to know what to do. We have a national referral mechanism in under construction. And it really is a sort of, it's like a railway map. You know what to do when. Every organization is in there. The immigration, the caretakers, law enforcement, but also judges. How to deal with the victim, not how to deal with the case, but maybe when the victim gets into the courthouse, how to accommodate, see to it that she's not at the same level as the perpetrator. All that kind of things, they will all be in this national referral mechanism. It's not all done yet, but, and of course it will always be under construction as we go on, we learn more. That is, I think, also a very good new development. And then we come to the last part of the prevention. We do not want re-victimization of victims, and yet it happens. And it happens because there's not enough, they don't have a safe enough network around them that is really something to work on. We've seen a lot with domestic, young girls from domestic trafficking, that they were seen not really as trafficking victims, but as girls with problems. So if you do not deal with the trafficking part, the chances are that she'll go back to the trafficker. There is research that a victim of trafficking generally goes back 5 to 6 times to the trafficker before she is really loose of that connection. So that too is an important, you have to know that too. If you think, okay, she goes back to her trafficker, well, then things are lost, and then it's her own fault. You don't really understand how this trafficking works. And those that do will know that she has to get out of that situation time and time again. When victims commit crimes or when they commit crimes while being in an exploitative situation, either because they have been forced to commit criminal acts or because they do not have the right papers or any other things, or just because this was the surroundings that they were in, then there should be a possibility for them not to be prosecuted or punished. This is already in the Convention of the Council of Europe, but it's also in the European Directive of 2011. I don't really know how, we talked about this, and it's not really in your law, I think, but I think it is something to really keep into account, because victims, knowing that they will be prosecuted, this gives perpetrators a huge means to blackmail them, to keep them, under control, so to speak. And for minors, we see that the aftercare, getting them back into the community, re-establish contact with the parents, and really very important, education. And like I said, they go back 4 or 5 times. So sometimes you have to put them in a closed environment. And of course, this infringes also on the rights of the child. But if it is for their own good, then I think you should do it. Now, key elements to prevent recidivism. Well, we don't really know. Why don't we know? Because there's very little psychological reports on perpetrators of human trafficking. So I think that there too, we should look at it and see if we cannot find ways on how to do something with that. But it is just as important as it is to get victims back into their life again. Because every perpetrator that doesn't commit these crimes again saves new victims. And either you put them in jail for, I don't know how many years. There was a huge case near Washington 3 years ago, where a young trafficker, I think he was 28, 29, exploited about 100 girls. That was a huge case. He was sentenced to 40 years imprisonment. That is in the Netherlands not something that would happen quickly, but I don't know how that is here. 100 girls is quite a lot, so maybe, but there are so many more of one perpetrator and 1 or 2 victims, and they get 3, 4, 5 years. I don't know how much they would get here. So there will be a time when they get out. It is important to deal with that part too. So this was the holistic approach, and I'm afraid I spoke too long. Well, we have one more. Okay.
That's it.
Oh, questions. I was going to say that, but okay, now you can read it.
Wonderful. So thank you again for an exhilarating presentation that really went into breadth, but also the depth of some of these issues. And it's never enough time. We never have enough time to talk about human trafficking. So please, round of applause. For any questions that you might have, and I'm sure there will be many.
I just have one. Focus more on the victim. Do you ever consider focusing on the perpetrator and the way in which to rehabilitate them and find out why they're doing these things?
Well, this is something that I think that more research is needed, and that's really very important to do that too. Like I said, one of my staff is now looking into perpetrators on domestic trafficking. One of the difficult things is that if you have traffickers from Albania or Hungary, it is very hard for the Dutch system to really get into why they've done it. I mean, it's that evaluation is hard, and you need that to get to the next phase. Besides that, if they are from those countries and they have committed really serious crimes in the Netherlands, they will be, well, they will not be let into the Netherlands. Well, they will come anyway, but officially they will be deemed to be an undesired alien.
Professor Klein?
Yeah, I wonder if I could ask you a very concrete question. There are people who argue that if sex work were decriminalized, and I must confess it's always seemed a reasonable option to me. But if it were decriminalized, that there would be less trafficking. Now, I understand that the Netherlands is an area where there is a red light district, and where there is a free market in sexual activity. I don't know what restrictions take place outside of that area. But I understand that freeing the area from controls did not work. And I wonder if you could talk about that the red light, even in the red light district of Amsterdam, that many of the women working in that district have been trafficked, and that the continued domination of the sex industry by traffickers and by criminal syndicates still took place. I wonder if you could specifically talk about that and how the Netherlands has dealt with the problem.
Absolutely. You must understand that till 2000, sex work was criminalized in the Netherlands. It was not legal to earn money off sex or to sell sex, and buyers weren't criminalized at that time. But of course, that was an old law of the beginning of the last century. And we saw that the sector was a high at risk of criminal elements. And you must also understand that the human trafficking, it was the same time. This was 2000 was the Palermo Protocol. So we were still, it was women trafficking that we talked about, but there weren't so many cases of those, and there wasn't that much awareness of that as a part of a much larger global problem. And the idea behind the decriminalization of sex, of prostitution, was to end or curb the criminal elements in it. And at that time, the women who worked in the red light districts were predominantly Dutch, were not so young. Some of them were maybe, but there were quite a number of 40-year-olds and sort of sturdy Dutch women. This was the model, and the aim was also kind of pragmatic. Then in 2000, and of course the emphasis was on the regulation. It was not as if there was sex work on the whole of the Netherlands. It was regulated, and there is still now are there illegal places. I mean, there's illegal prostitution that will be prosecuted, and in illegal prostitution we see more human trafficking. But we thought that in the regulated parts, trafficking would be regulated out, so to speak. Police are constantly present there. They talk to the women. They look at the books of the brothel keeper. There are hygienic rules. There is care around them. In the beginning, many of them voiced that this made their work safer, which it did, I think, because street prostitution was eradicated. That's practically nowhere in the Netherlands that you see street prostitution. Prostitution under 18 is illegal at all times. That is a fixed thing in the law. Now, when in 2006 and the years following that, we saw that there was a large group of Bulgarian women that were forced into prostitution by Turkish perpetrators, a large criminal organization. I think 16 perpetrators were apprehended, and most of them were convicted. That really threw another light on what we were doing. And I think maybe this is also something about the Netherlands. We are not pretending we know it all. And some things go right, some things go wrong. So we try things. And trying it's maybe not the best word, but sometimes you have to experience what's happening and to see what would be the best solution. And I think that there's no country in the world that doesn't struggle with how to deal with prostitution. What policy will be the best? And I know that there are people who say prostitution is always trafficking. We don't say that, I don't say that. There are women who choose for prostitution. Maybe it's not always a positive choice. Maybe it is also a choice from poverty. And if it's really extreme circumstances, you could never call it a choice. But if it's forced, then it's trafficking. There's no doubt about it. Now, I think one of the positive results of our lifting the ban on brothels in 2000 was that our law enforcement really focused on the trafficking part, not just in the regulated, legalized areas, but all over, via the internet, house prostitution, apartments, wherever. They would really follow leads because there where it's illegal, they thought there it will most likely be forced or coerced. There were no longer any minors in the prostitution world, in the regulated world. That was really eradicated there. And the brothel owners really looked, they really took care to abide by all the rules, because if they didn't, they would lose their license and their lucrative income. In 2007, I advised the government to adapt the legislation on prostitution and well, make some significant changes that would harmonize it more throughout the country, because if you see that one municipality is puts much more effort in looking at it, they will go somewhere else. So this bill that was designed in 2008, I think, because they quite quickly adopted my recommendation. It went up to our Senate and came back, so it's still not a law. We see that there is a discussion in the Netherlands on what is the best way, and it could very well be that we will change again. I mean, I think that is one of the things that the Netherlands is, I mean, I'm not saying that we're good at everything, but this is one of the things we are good at, to listen to criticism. I mean, I am a paid criticism for the Netherlands, and if I think that there are areas that should be improved, I say that. And of course, that's what being independent means, and also maybe some experience in different fields. So we are looking at this, and I think that no matter what prostitution policy you have, if you think that by criminalizing prostitution you will end trafficking, I don't believe that. Even if you criminalize prostitution, you will have to look at all the areas where, you have to look elsewhere, because it will still exist. And we see that in Sweden, and I have a very good relationship with my Swedish colleague. And of course, she's not independent, so she will always say that their system is the best, which is okay. But if I look at how many trafficking cases have been brought before the judge in Sweden, and how many have been brought before the judge, have been brought to court in the Netherlands, I think I can truly say that the emphasis on trafficking is predominant in law enforcement, and more so than prostitution. And I think that is something we have to fight, the trafficking. And fighting the prostitution would be second on my list or third on my list, but definitely not number one. Now that said, I think that it is also very interesting to have a moral debate within the country. What do you want? How do you see prostitution? And one of the things is that I see is that the younger generation tends to look at prostitution more, how do you say that? Well, more like the Nordic model, so to speak, than my or your generation does. So it is difficult. It will always be difficult. We will never eradicate either prostitution or human trafficking completely, but I think that trying to get there is really the most important thing. And I would be extremely interested to see how this will be working in Canada, because we've talked to the task force yesterday, and they've done some research and they will monitor what's happening. So yes, I think if the Netherlands will, if there is a time that we can really substantiate that prostitution always leads to trafficking, and if you criminalize prostitution, you will end trafficking, then I will advise my government to do that too. But up till now, we can't say that. Has that answered your question?
I'm just wondering though, since you legalized prostitution, are you record keeping on the number of prostitutes that are entering into the business or registered in the business? Do you have that information? Because I'm curious, as society educates itself about it and women become more educated and have options for education, will young girls make that choice to become a prostitute? And so
Well, we've heightened, this is also in the new bill, the age to 21 because,
to become a prostitute
yeah,
in the legalized
yeah.
system.
What we tried in this bill was registration. Not registration per se, but because it would be combined with an intake by the health services to really see whether or not this was a real decision or not. This was really my recommendation, and this bill didn't make the Senate. So I think it's too bad. And of course, registration is, for some people, think, oh, I don't want to be registered as a prostitute. But if you want it to be more and more like, well, you can never really see a normal profession because it isn't and it never will be. But if you want to give it the effects of a legal profession, you should be able to open a bank account. You should pay taxes, and you shouldn't be afraid to be registered. So if that would lead women not to do this, okay, that's fine. But if you think that this is a profession or the kind of thing you want to do, well, these are within a regulated, legalized area, then these are the things that go with it. Oh, I'm sorry. I think maybe you're better to point out
Yes,
who.
yes.
I have a question. You mentioned in the slides that a lot of people are they're trafficked for labor, and you said that internationally, this is the largest part of human trafficking. My question is, a lot of these people, I've read documentaries, I watched documentaries, I've read articles saying that a lot of the larger corporations play a big role in that. And what role does the international community have towards solving labor and trafficking when it comes to labor in relevance to these corporations, and how do we sort of eradicate this sort of cheap labor and the exploitation of specifically women in that way?
Well, very good question. We've had, of course, the factory in Bangladesh and very bad instances. I think that there's a chain responsibility all through the production line. And that is something that is also advocated by NGOs. UofT is a very good NGO on that subject in California. And of course the ILO says the same thing. Our government says it too, doesn't always abide by it itself. So then I say something about that too. It's hard. I think the consumer has a responsibility, and maybe that's not on this presentation. If you look at slaveryfootprint.org, I don't know who of you know that website, you can see how many slaves are working for you. And you can see that by how many cars you have, how many phones or tablets you have, or how many rooms your house has. This is what you can see then. I had too many working for me, but I'm sure you will have some also. If you look at cheap clothes, I don't know how many of you here, but in a lot of younger generation in the Netherlands is really very concerned about the organic growth of mushrooms or lettuce or whatever. And they want to know where it's grown, and eggs should be free range. But you should have the same concern of who picks those mushrooms. Okay, let them be organic or not, but if they're picked by somebody who is exploited, I'd rather have the, and I can't say factory mushrooms, but you know, non-organic, picked by somebody with a normal wage. That has to get into the minds of people too. But that said, there are of course poor people, poor families who have to feed and clothe I don't know how many children. They are not really in a position to buy the more expensive. They wouldn't buy the organic maybe either, but they wouldn't, you know. So I think that too, I think that the responsibility lies with companies and with the governments to urge companies to do that work. Yeah. You're the one who, this gentleman has.
I think there's a connection between availability of employment with, probably with the rate of trafficking. But if we're dealing with criminal activities, regardless of how many jobs are created in a country, there will always be, the criminal gangs will always find a way to kidnap, to traffic these people. So I think we may be putting too much emphasis on the connection. Okay. So my question is, in terms of the integration in Europe, integration of the economies in Europe, what, if any, has been the push in order to eliminate the gangs that are actually undergoing or involved in human trafficking?
Well, in the beginning when
In
Poland...
that, sorry, but the other question I have is also in terms of the integration. Does it become much easier because of the mobility within the European countries? Does it become easier for traffickers to actually move, these women around for these various
Or
countries?
men? Yes, it is absolutely easier. And a lot of it is done via the internet. So we have to look at all these circumstances, of course. And the opening of the borders has brought a lot of good for many, many people, but it's also brought bad things. I mean, also for the criminals, the borders have opened. It's like the internet. It's brought, I don't know how much good to the whole of the world, but we also have child pornography, and we have to deal with that, and that's not the fault of the internet. It's just, that's what it is. So if I look at your first question, the mobility has changed. I think the globalization, and not just within the EU, but the globalization has too added to this mobilization of people. And people, when they are in poverty or terrible circumstances, will go and look for a better place. That's normal. So there was a time when people would say, "Oh, okay, I have this man from Hungary and or Poland or whatever, and he paints my house and I pay him a pittance, but hey, it's more than he would earn in his country of origin." Now I think we've dealt with that by now. The awareness is there, and our Supreme Court said it. If you have somebody who works in the Netherlands, you have a right to the way we pay people in the Netherlands. And it doesn't matter how much you earn in your country of origin. Now, I've talked also to a professor of sociology from Malaysia who said to me, all this human trafficking stuff you're talking about, it's just a way to stop migration. And looking at it from a completely different perspective. The difference, I think one of the great difference between the situation now and in the time that there was still slavery, is that people very often practically offer themselves or are lured or misled, thinking that, okay, maybe I'll work there for some time and get hardly paid anything, but once I'm in there, and you know, I'll get somewhere. And I think it's the responsibility of the country of destination to see to it that illegal work or too low wages or bad circumstances, that there is an inspection that sees to that. Yeah.
I don't want to hit you with too much of a broad question, but could you speak a little bit to the international legal dimension, like within the Netherlands or the EU, regarding perpetrators and or victims? So in terms of basically, if you wanted to prosecute, for example, a perpetrator or help a bunch of victims, say in the Vietnamese case you talked about, how like the rights you have in the Netherlands as opposed to, for example, Vietnam, for example, getting investigatory information, say from Vietnam, if you wanted to pursue perpetrators, etc. Like, what are some of the challenges and successes that you faced in that kind of component of human trafficking?
Like I said, it's a crime that you go out and get. That means you go and get the perpetrators too. Victims are very reluctant often to come forward, either because they think they still love the man who's trafficking them, or because they're just too scared. So if there is we call that a programmatic approach. If there is a sector where human trafficking, where there are anecdotal stories about human trafficking or signs, then the police will observe, put observation teams there. They will tap telephones or other communication to find evidence of that. And like I said, this huge case in the Amsterdam in the red light district with the Bulgarian victims, none of these would come forward. But once the perpetrators were apprehended on the basis of intelligence-led investigation, then the victims would cooperate, or some of them did. So those are the. It's a very severe crime. So the authorities do the special ways to investigate, like the observations and the means to do that, are in the Netherlands related to the severity of the crime. And human trafficking is at the top. Well, not called murder is a little higher, but it's nearly at the top of the list.
And so kind of as a corollary to that,
Could you speak?
as a corollary to that, like regarding, for example, perpetrator prosecution and accessing kind of the infrastructure in other countries, say outside of the EU, or particularly countries who may not be signatories to the Palermo Protocol or other examples, like who gets the jurisdiction there specifically?
There's an extraterritorial jurisdiction in, I think, many countries. And there is in the Netherlands, but I know within the whole EU there's that. And I think Canada has the same. I know the US has the same. So I would say that that is quite broadly covered. That hardly ever leads to problems in the Netherlands in judiciary. But it is a good question, because what we want to see is a situation where, whether you're prosecuted in the Netherlands or in the UK, there will be about the same. That will not really happen, because within the EU the criminal code and the investigative powers is really something that every country wants to keep for themselves. But the UN is now building a website with international verdicts, convictions, or acquittals, rulings by courts all over the world. It's still in early days, but what we would want is that, for instance, the matters of coercion or force will be dealt with in the same way in every country, and the intention to exploit that will mean the same thing in every country, because it's the Palermo Protocol. What I hear from colleagues from other countries is that, for instance, some countries, even within the EU, have a problem with seeing domestic trafficking as trafficking. You may have heard of two big cases in the UK, in Oxfordshire and Rotherham, where a huge number of girls were sexually exploited and the police had done nothing. Now, all the media attention called it sexual exploitation. And I never read the word domestic trafficking or interior trafficking, which it was. And what's the difference between calling it by the name that I think it should be called by, is that it gives a whole different level of protection for victims. If you prosecute prostitution, there will be a fine for the perpetrator, and there's really nothing for the victim. If you prosecute human trafficking, the penalty for the perpetrator will be considerably higher, and the protection and the help and care for the victim will also be considerably higher. So that's why I think that the emphasis should be with human trafficking. Yeah.
Hi, you were talking about those 3 cases you had in one day, and one of the things that I noticed is all of them were about sexual luring by a boyfriend. I'm wondering in Holland or the Dutch government if there's been anything done in a prevention capacity to specifically target that and speak to potential victims regarding that particular area. I've been doing a lot of work in this area. I've not seen anything being done in that area, so I'm curious if there's...
Well, one of them were Chinese people who exploited girls, Chinese couple, so it was only
It's a
2
little-
of them,
yeah,
but
so
okay,
two,
more than
right,
enough.
yeah.
Yes, there are many preventative programs developed. In one of my reports, we did a meta-analysis of all these programs. In some instances, it's even said that by targeting a victim, you give ideas to boys. So this would be, well, not the best effect you want. I think
Was that been proven?
excuse me?
Was that proven that by
Yeah, that
warning
was
the girls that the guys could act on
It's
that?
in the same class that well, yes.
Oh, wow.
I know, well, I heard of one incident where we have this junior college where you can learn everything, boys and girls, and there was this boy who was in the mechanic division, and he said to his mentor that he wanted to become a hairdresser, to be in the beauty division. And this was a boy from a Moroccan ethnicity, and many of the lover boys, as we call them, are from that background. And this teacher said to me, well, what should I do? And I said, well, let him come back the next day with his father and explain to you, with his father present, that he wants to be a beautician. And he never came. So it's, there too, it needs awareness, knowing that this is not, I mean, if this boy wants to go to another area to befriend possible victims, be aware as a teacher, do something about it.
Your personal anecdote about the Croatian migrants living across the street from you, and the exact petition being that all of that's just what immigrants do or foreigners do, that really interested me, because I see a lot of the similar sentiment or expectation of a certain level of exploitation within the in-group of a migrant group that exists in a host country. And I'm wondering if there has been any attempt to reach out to these specific ethnic or immigrant groups to give them the education as a preventative tool.
Yeah, well, we see that too, and I think the Chinese population in the Netherlands is a very closed population where you can, well, where a bit more education would be a good thing. So Chinese restaurants are really, have been a target for law enforcement to see if there was any exploitation there, and we've seen some of that. Chinese massage parlors is the same. I think that the important thing is that the awareness should be broad, and if you see, for instance, in a agricultural sector that there are large groups from Romania, then I think that and who do not just work the fields there, but also sleep at the farm, are housed at the farm. Maybe there's a small shop at the farm that they buy their stuff, which is much more expensive than if they would go outside. Those are the circumstances that law enforcement and the municipality should be alert to, and then see if there's an exploitative situation.
So I sort of have a comment. You spoke about the organic food and how like the young people they want to be more conscious about what they're eating, and then you said it's more important about food food, and that should be better. That should be better. So my question is, why can't they just make their own food? So you don't have to worry about giving other people wages to grow your food for you. Because a lot of the human trafficking that we're talking about, if it's connected to the agriculture market, why, if consumers are important in this as well, so why can't we why is it that we don't have enough time to grow our food or make these things, but there's people out there in the world that are being human trafficked that have time. They just have time to be able to go and grow food for us.
Well, that may be, but also people from those other countries who migrate to your country to do it maybe around the corner. So it's I think it's a little bit more complex than that. And migration is, I think, now part of the way we live. It's part of, well, the whole global society. And whether it is to work in another country or to study in another country, I think that globalization on the whole is a good thing. But there are bad things about it too. And well, maybe it's interesting because you would maybe say, why can't you grow your own stuff? Well, I don't know what phone you have, but if we look at the iPhone, you know where the chips are made. And so it's a multi-layered problem, and I think that the awareness into it should be multi-layered as well, and it'll take time. And it's good that I mean, I'm not saying it's good that it takes time, but it's I would wish it would go quicker, but I don't get discouraged, and I think that because it's such a multi-layered problem, it doesn't, if you only push here, it will spring up there. So it is really something that you need this broad view on. And that is, I think, something that in the Netherlands, I, as a national rapporteur, can provide.
So we have time for 2 more questions. Yes, please. Again? Okay.
My question is related, and it got sprung from your anecdote about the workers being across the street. In terms of like awareness, when we speak of awareness, it's like it just makes sense when people know. Obviously, you're able to make better choices. But I guess when it comes time to actually dealing with such as you calling the police or whatever, like the actual systems in place for you to use the knowledge that you have. So in thinking that human trafficking will always be here, I'm thinking of what systems are in place for you to use the awareness that you do know, or to deal with I guess, what's in front of you, but actually having like either a hotline or just these different kinds of things that actually deal specifically with human trafficking instead of the constant collaboration that goes with human trafficking.
Well, there is more in place now than there was. The story I was talking about is years and years ago. And I think we have a Crime Stoppers facility. I don't know if you have that here too. I think so. So where you can call in anonymously. And I also think, and this has been one of my goals also, that it's not just a specialized division that knows and that should know everything about human trafficking, but at the front desk, so to speak, they should be sensitized enough to know where to get the next information. I mean, everybody knows that if you have pain on your chest and your left arm, you should go to a hospital, but you don't have to be able to do any heart surgery or do whatever. You just have to know that those are the symptoms. And I think that that is also something that we need for human trafficking, to know the symptoms and to know where to go to with these symptoms.
Yes, I'm sorry. Professor Quayson will have to take the last question.
My apologies for I have to teach. But there's something you mentioned a moment ago about the teacher whose student wanted to become a beautician, who then invited his father. This also brings to mind the question of what the educational system in general, because teachers are now encouraged to sex education, for example, so they're well informed about sex education, sexuality education, and so on. What would it take to actually train teachers, to sensitize teachers to these things, and not for them necessarily to teach their students, but to be aware of because that would be a huge across the world, you know, or in places where, because there's human trafficking everywhere for labor, for sexual exploitation. What would it take for, you know, government in Europe, for example, to take the lead to introduce this into the teacher training curriculum? It would be big.
I think that partly this has been not really in the curriculum, but it's been an important topic within a lot of the secondary schools. Because at a time, a lot of the recruitment was done by the school, not by nearby the schools. So you would sort of sensitize teachers that if somebody is lurking around the school and addressing young girls, what's he doing there? I mean, but so much has moved to the internet. So we need, so that complicates it too. So we really have to look at that. But one of the things that we did find was that where the victims and traffickers come from is very often the same background, and that can help you to know where there are recruitment situations.
And I know there's been some research, but it's mostly through the works of NGOs who deal directly with victims. There's a lot of indication that the recruitment for sex trafficking is happening at school, in school backyards, in parking lots adjacent to schools, targeted towards 12-year-olds, 13-year-olds. So it's education and educators in general have a big role to play. We would love to keep you here longer. I would personally like to spend the whole weekend with you to talk about these things, but we will continue to be gracious and very thankful hosts.